So this evening, the first three sessions of the ethics curriculum that we've done is very sort of conceptual. What do we owe human beings by virtue of being human beings, and what do we owe fellow Jews in virtue of being, the fact that they're Jewish, and tonight we're focusing on something really very specific as a topic of Jewish ethics, which is Jewish views towards the environment. I will say, after we've been talking, and I did the same sessions in the morning class about ethics of what we owe all human beings versus what we owe Jews. On Shabbat morning, somebody approached me and said, Rabbi, I really want to take issue with the emails that you've been sending out asking us to support Masorti Olami, the conservative movement that is helping Ukrainian Jewish refugees. Don't we owe it to help all refugees? And I thought, aha, you should have been taking the class. Because on some level, of course, we know that we want to do as much as we can to help as many people as we can, of course. But I also, said to him, millions and millions of people all over the world are helping Ukrainian refugees. Who specifically is helping Jewish refugees? If Jews don't help other Jews, nobody else is going to step in. I mean, yes, as part of the general refugee population, if you happen to be Jewish. But I said to him, I have a colleague in Berlin, conservative synagogue in Berlin, and her community has, they're calling them their new friends. They sponsored their new friends, 40 Jews from the Masorti, from the conservative movement in Ukraine, are now living in Berlin, and they need housing and food and all the things that refugees would need. And their kids, if they're preschoolers, are already in the synagogue's preschool, and she's needs help. And we also have a colleague in Budapest, a conservative synagogue in Budapest, who's also welcomed Jewish refugee families. So he said to me, well, how did they know who they were? I said, because this organization has been working, like United Synagogue knows who we are. This organization that works with all conservative synagogues in Europe has been working with them for years and knows the leadership personally. And so was able to help these people figure out in some ways how to, maybe not how to get out, but once they got out, how to get them help. Do you want to go to Israel? Do you want to go to Berlin? Do you want to go to Budapest? Because they have a relationship with them. That's how they know. So I thought, well, considering we've been speaking about this now for 3 weeks, I felt like, well, here's a real life example of, choices that need to be made. None of us have the ability to help every refugee family, or even really very few refugee families. And how would we decide? And then I said to him, I didn't issue like a tax. I didn't force you to pay to this organization. It was just a suggestion. If you don't like it, there are many, many other organizations of which you could donate money to that are helping refugees. But, if I don't tell you about this organization and about what conservative Jews are doing in other places in the world, how would you even know? So I just thought that was a very interesting, I don't know what he ended up doing, but I thought that was a very interesting real world example about, how do we figure out, and, obviously in some level it's an individual choice, but it seemed fairly obvious to me, if you've ever donated to Federation in your life, that you understand that there is a value in helping other members in the Jewish community. And if you give to the special JUF Ukrainian Refugee Fund, some of that money will get to the Jewish Agency and the Joint Distribution Committee, which are helping to resettle Ukrainian Jews in Israel. So that's another very worthy cause to support. So, but now we're going to turn our attention to Jewish views on environmentalism. This is actually, would be a great session before Tu B'Shvat, because of course on the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, we celebrate the birthday of the trees, and it's a time that people like to focus on environmental issues. And Judaism, as you know, no surprise, has quite a bit to say about this. In one of the, when we talked about universal ethics versus creation ethics, one of the things that I pointed out is that there are two stories of the creation of Adam. And in one story, the one story, of course, they're both Adam and Eve are both created in God's image. Second story, you know, the rib. And one story, it says that Adam is told to rule over the world and to conquer it. And in another, and in the second retelling, it's told that you are to guard it. And so this sort of dual conquer and guard, you know, plays into the issue of Jewish environmentalism. We are expected to be good stewards of the earth, but at the same time, we are also allowed to use the earth's resources. So, you know, when God told Adam to be fruitful and multiply and fill the world, there wasn't that much damage human beings could do to the earth. But today, given that every day we read about, you know, the damage that we're doing and the worry that we won't be able to undo that damage, the idea of how you balance guarding and ruling over has, you know, really serious implications. So let's look at some sources. So Ecclesiastes Rabbah is what in Jewish literature is called a midrash. It's a homily, really, basically, is probably the easiest way to describe it. There are volumes of midrash for every really pretty much almost every book of the Bible. Not every book, but mostly every book. And it takes text and it sort of elucidates it. Sort of almost sermonizes about how we think about whatever value that they want to talk about. So they're quoting a verse from the book of Ecclesiastes that says, "See the works of God, for who can repair that which he has perverted." Right? So when you look around and you see God's world and the beautiful world that God created, if you perverted it, who's going to be able to fix it? So now it's imagining a conversation between God and Adam in the Garden of Eden. So this doesn't actually take place in the Torah, even though God does, you know, show Adam around the Garden of Eden. If you remember, he shows him all the animals, and Adam names all the animals. And through the process of naming the animals, he realizes that everybody else, every other living creature has a partner, and he alone doesn't have a partner. And that's, of course, what spurs the creation of the first woman. So in this imagining, like, what would God and Adam actually speak about if they were walking through the garden together? What might that conversation have looked like? So when God created the first human being, God took him around to see all of the trees of the Garden of Eden and said to him, "See my creations, how beautiful and praiseworthy they are. And all that I have created for you. Be careful not to ruin or destroy my world, for if you ruin it, no one will repair it after you." So part of what's fascinating about this text is that it's 2,000 years old. Like that it presumes that human beings can actually do a great deal of damage, even though, again, I mean, they could chop down trees. I suppose you could in some ways pollute, but really, you know, before factories, before cars, before all, you know, how bad could it be? And yet 2,000 years ago, this text already is warning that it could be bad. And that, so there's two things that this text sort of juxtaposes one against the other, and it kind of feeds into this, you know, conquer and guard. First of all, look how beautiful the world is. You know, look around at the world and look how beautiful the world is. I think we've hopefully all had an experience, whether you stood at a mountain or, you know, at the seashore or watched a beautiful sunset, and we're caught, you know, in those moments of awe at the absolute beauty of nature. And you see how beautiful it is. All that I've created for you. So let's just stop that for a moment. What does that mean? What do you think God means when he says to Adam, everything I've created for you? Nothing? Okay, well, I take it to mean, right, that the world, and there are other sources that say this, that the world was created for us. It was created for us to use. It was created, so see these beautiful trees, it was created for you. Like, you can appreciate the trees, but if you need to cut them down to build a house, it was created for you. It was created for you to use it, to enjoy it, but also to use it. And the world wasn't created, the world was created for human beings, which is, I've shared this before. Sometimes the teenagers have a hard time with this, that it's very clear in Jewish thought that human beings are the pinnacle of creation. So the world was created for our sake. Actually, there's a rabbinic teaching that you should carry around 2 pieces of paper in each pocket. One piece of paper should say, the world was created just for me, right? Not us, me. Like, the world was created for me. I'm that special that the world was created for me. And in the other pocket, remember, my end is dust and worms. So these are supposed to be the things that keep us, I guess, balanced, right? On some level, the world was created for each individual to use and to thrive and to flourish. And at the same time, our fate is to die like every other human being that ever lived. And you're special, but you're not that special. You're special, but the laws of nature still are going to apply. And of course, if every single person is carrying that piece of paper around, it means every single person is just as special as you are. So on one hand, the text says, I gave you the world, like, use it. And then it says, however, if you ruin it, God's like not going to step in and save us. There's not going to be a last minute miracle that's going to redo the damage of climate change. No, nobody's going to step in no divine being is going to step in to save us. Sometimes, I don't know if you've seen this, but I've seen this on a rare occasion where people talk about, if things get too bad down here, we'll go to Mars, we'll go to the moon, or we'll live. And it's like, it would have to be pretty bad to try to move. First of all, the whole population isn't going to be able to move, but how bad would it have to be? How inhospitable would the world have to be to feel that the only place you could move was someplace that was even less hospitable? Like, on some level, it's a crazy thing to think that there's an out, right? If we destroy this world, and unfortunately, we already are seeing some of the effects of this. And there's a lot of talk about climate refugees and it's going to happen to people whose islands have flooded, or whose places that they live are now a desert, and there's no way to have water or to grow food. And so what this warning from 2,000 years ago sounds pretty immediate, given what we can all see is happening in the world. So let's look at the next source. So this is another, a text that's about 2,000 years old. And this is a different way. This isn't talking about the environment per se, but it's talking about our ability, human beings' ability to perfect the world. And what is our responsibility? So we have one responsibility is, don't harm the world, right? Don't make the world worse. But are there ways, and this is a very Jewish text, right? This is not a text that I think you could possibly, the first text I think anybody could relate to. You could teach it in an interfaith luncheon and everybody, would get it and agree with you and understand this is a very ecumenical text. The next text is a very Jewish text, and I don't know that I would call it necessarily, well, maybe the environment, but what is our role as partners with God, and how could we actually improve what God created? So on one level, the first text is, the world is so beautiful, and yes, we can use it, but none of us would have the ability to create this beautiful world. But the next text is this Jewish value of human beings responsibility to help perfect the world that we were given by God, and that there are things that we can do that actually are better. God gave us the raw materials, and we work with those materials. So Turnus Rufus. So this is an interesting character. Look, I have to back up quite a bit so you'll understand this text. So one of the great rabbis of the rabbinic era was Rabbi Akiva. If you know, you may know a lot about him, or you may know nothing about him. The story of Rabbi Akiva is he was a very poor shepherd. And he fell in love with his boss's daughter, and they married. And guess what? The boss was not happy. He did not want his wealthy daughter marrying this poor shepherd. And so he kind of cut her off. But she was not happy being married to a poor shepherd, because she realized that Rabbi Akiva was brilliant. And so she worked her fingers to the bone. Her name was Rachel. She worked her fingers to the bone so Rabbi Akiva could go study at yeshiva. So at 40 years old, he became a Talmud scholar. And she was very happy, even though she had a hard life. She was happy to work. This is a rabbinic fantasy, a romantic fantasy, right? So different cultures would probably have different fantasies of what would be the ultimate romance. But in rabbinic literature, the ultimate romance is you fall in love and your wife is willing to work her finger to the bone so you can leave her and go study far away from her, and become a well-respected scholar. So this is a rabbinic not a modern rabbinic fantasy, but this is an ancient rabbinic fantasy. So Rabbi Akiva becomes a great scholar. And if you then, of course, know how the story continues, the Romans who have conquered Israel forbid Torah study. And Rabbi Akiva continues to teach Torah at risk to his own life. And eventually he is caught and he's tortured to death. And we read about that every Yom Kippur. So it's a very difficult story, right? It's a difficult story, especially if you were to believe that the reward for a life of Torah study would be, a good life, a long life. But it's a martyred life, along with other rabbis of his generation. So Turnus Rufus is his Roman jailer. So Akiva is thrown into prison, and then there are a series of midrashim that have these imaginary conversations. And so Turnus Rufus is sort of the foil. He's representing Roman thought and arguing with Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva is defending Jewish thought. So that's sort of, and maybe these some similar, maybe not between these two particular characters, but we know that there were, throughout Jewish history, there were dialogue between many different cultures, and the question of why Jews maintained their ways, why didn't they see how wonderful the Hellenistic culture was, how wonderful the Roman culture was, how wonderful Islamic religion was, how wonderful Lutheranism and Protestantism was, and abandoned their Jewish ways for this better system. So this is sort of throughout our history. I don't know, maybe in some ways the question asked by a Jew, like, why are we still giving to Jews instead of giving to everybody? Perhaps that's still an echo of this question of why do we maintain I said on the Sunday night call, we were talking about Darrell Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews, that sometimes things that, people accuse us of, we feel is anti-Semitic. And so there was a Pew study, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. And one of the questions was, do you think Jews are clannish and care more for Jews than anybody else? And a huge percentage of people said yes. So I kind of laughed, because I thought my whole career I've been trying to teach our community to be clannish and care for other Jews. So on one level, were they anti-Semitic? Or did they consider this something that they should respect about the Jewish community, that we're clannish and we take care of each other? Like we don't know. Like, it's a hard question to interpret. Like, maybe they thought that that they were praising us. But the way it was phrased sounds disturbing to Jews. So, all right, so there's this dispute, and let's see what Turnus Rufus and Akiva are up to. So Turnus Rufus, the wicked. So you understand what the rabbis think of him. Like, he's Akiva's jailer. He represents Rome, and he's a bad guy. Ask Akiva, which are more beautiful, the works of God or the works of flesh and blood? Now, you could probably tell if we just stopped there, if I had said to you, without showing you this midrash, which is more beautiful, the works of human beings or the works of God, you would probably say the works of God, because you'd think of mountains and you'd think of oceans, and you'd be embarrassed to say that it was absolutely chutzpahdik to say that human beings could possibly create anything as wonderful as God. A gazillion years ago, one of my sister-in-laws, really, this was like Green Acres. She loved the big city, loved the big city. And my brother-in-law was a skier. And so they moved to Wyoming, and she could see the mountains out her window. And we said to her, how do you like living in the mountains? And she said, well, they're beautiful, but when I look out my window, I really wish I was seeing tall buildings. Which was, like, what if you love the city? What if you look at, the Chicago skyline and think this is when you're like out on the water on a summer night, we have a friend that has a boat, and it's just starting to get dark and all the lights of the buildings of Chicago light up. It's magnificent, right? Like, there are things that you could look at that human beings created, that you could have that kind of awe, and think that it's absolutely one of the most beautiful things you've ever seen. So the question is really more complicated than you would think. At first blush, you would say, well, of course, God. But then, listen, I cried when I got my first vaccine, and for COVID, and there was a prayer about, thank you, God, for imbuing us with the wisdom to create a vaccine that will hopefully save the world. So even though the vaccines didn't, keep anybody from ever getting sick, they are amazing, right? They're amazing. And they've protected so many people around the world from, serious COVID. And so this is really a text about that, right? This is a text about God didn't create the vaccine, but is at its best, if you are a person that believes in God, it is a connection between human beings and the divine. And if you don't believe that God has anything to do with it, then you got to admit that human beings can do some pretty amazing, human beings can do some pretty amazing things. So he asked the question, and Akiva responds in this perhaps would have been surprising way: those of flesh and blood are more beautiful. Turnus Rufus, the wicked, responded, behold the heavens and the earth. Can you make something like them? Which, of course, yes, the mountains, the stars, like, well, of course not. And you see them and they're so beautiful. And Akiva responds, do not speak with me about something which is beyond humans, for they do not control them, but regarding things that are found among people. So, okay, yes, of course we can't compete with God on a certain level, but why would we even have that discussion? That's so obvious. So let's talk about what human beings can do. So then he asked him this question that for the Romans would be very odd, which is, why do you circumcise? Right? Here you're handed in Hellenistic thought, this perfectly beautiful baby. Why would you do this surgical procedure? Like, why would, and if you know anything about the time of Hellenism, many Jews stopped circumcising because it was so looked down upon in Greek culture. And some Jews tried to reverse their circumcision. We have stories about that, because the Greeks looked at this as your body is perfect, and why would you possibly mar it? And of course, Judaism has a very, very different view of this. And so Akiva said, I knew you were going to ask that. Like, of all the things you were going to ask, I knew you were going to ask that. Hence, I said in advance that the works of flesh and blood are more beautiful than those of God. he brought, so we actually think that a circumcised baby boy is, well, I don't know if I would use the word more beautiful, but the circumcision is the sign of the covenant with God. When we circumcise a baby boy, a brit milah, not a circumcision in a hospital, but a ritual circumcision, we are saying that through the organ that is responsible for male procreation, this now belongs, it's a sign of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. And therefore, through this procedure, there is such a spiritual elevation that this baby, and I would say then, a Jewish man, is perfected, is spiritually perfected, or at least begins the process of spiritual perfection. No 8-day baby is, has mastered spiritual perfection. It's a lifelong activity. But this sign has elevated this human body and this organ that can be used for bad and indiscriminately, and ways that can be very hurtful, and has sanctified it. And so it has, therefore, has in the view of Rabbi Akiva and the Jewish view, has improved it. So then he said, he brought him ears and loaves, and he said to them, these are the works of God, and these are the works of flesh and blood. Are these not more beautiful? They brought him bundles of flax and garments from Beit Sha'an. I love this little, we know where Beit Sha'an is. It's a city in Israel. So it's like right over there. That city is, mentioned in this piece that's 2,000 years old. He said, these are the works of God. These are the works of flesh and blood. Are these not more beautiful? One of the things that Rabbi Frankel used to teach, Rabbi Frankel Alav HaShalom, the founding rabbi of our congregation, who many of you had the real privilege of knowing, and unfortunately not all of you on the call had the opportunity to know him. But he used to say that his favorite blessing, or his favorite, most important blessing, was hamotzi, right? What we say over the blessing of the bread. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who created bread from the earth. And Rabbi Frankel said what he felt was so beautiful about that blessing is that God doesn't create bread from the earth. God creates wheat, which, eaten raw isn't going to, who would want to do that, right? It's not going to, but human beings take this wheat and perfect it into loaves of bread. And so it becomes the ultimate in partnership between taking this raw product, before the days when people thought bread was bad. Remember when people used to think bread was the staff of life and it fed the whole world, and transformed wheat into something that would sustain people. And so too in this story, he brought him ears of corn and loaves. So what's better, a raw ear of corn that grows out of the ground, or bread that's made from corn? What's better, flax that you picked from the field, or clothes that were made out of that flax? So Rabbi Akiva says his argument is, and throws in circumcision in there, and by the way, the Romans banned circumcision. It was illegal to circumcise baby boys under Roman rule. That human creations are better than God's creations, because God gives us the raw material, but it's humans that perfect it. I've taught this before, but when Shai was in college, our oldest son Shai was in college, he worked in a lab. His major was biomedical engineering, and he worked in a lab. And one of the things that he worked with was foreskins. Foreskins, the cells, he's in the other room, I could ask him to come and explain this, but I'll give you my very layman's version of this. Foreskin cells, this always sounds a little crass when I say this, actually are easy to grow. Foreskin cells also can be used, they can be grown into different things, different kinds of organs. I don't know why, and I don't understand why, but they're versatile. And so they're for research and thinking about, regeneration of limbs, or thinking about, they were working on, I think, heart valves, that these things could be used to create other things that would help human beings. And I thought, for 2,000 years, we circumcised baby boys, whether ritually or in the hospital, and threw the foreskin in the garbage. until somebody discovered that this could actually be something that would really, help human beings. And I thought to myself, God has an amazing sense of humor. Like God's probably just been waiting. Like I've been waiting. I was waiting 2,000 years. Oh, you find now you like this has been hidden from you because you didn't have you hadn't created technology for all of humanity. And now you've created the technology that has unlocked this secret that was built into human beings. So I thought that was that was even more dramatic than maybe more dramatic than bread. And he's in the other room, so he's probably gonna say, you explained that all wrong. So human beings can create things more beautiful than God. And so Turnus Rufus said to him, if God, well, great, but if God wanted you to circumcise, why doesn't the child leave its mother's womb already circumcised? Like if this is the perfection, then why aren't babies born? Why aren't baby boys born perfect? Why, if that's what God wanted? In other words, you think that's what God wants, but it's not what God wants. And Rabbi Akiva responded, why does the umbilical cord come out attached to the baby? Does not his mother cut his umbilical cord? So why does the child not leave the womb already circumcised? Because God gave Israel the commandments to purify them. Therefore, David said, every word of God is pure. So God gave us the ability to do this mitzvah. It's actually a gift, right? To be able to do this mitzvah, to perfect or to purify this body, and through that, the connection of God and the Jewish people. And by the way, there, we cut the umbilical cord. You don't say that's, you got to leave that attached until until it falls off. So, this isn't the only example. Of course, that doesn't cause the baby any pain. So let me just stop there. So you've got two versions of sort of, I guess Hartman is calling it environmentalism. The first one is the idea that you better be careful not to destroy God's world. And the second one is human beings have the ability and actually the responsibility to perfect God's world. So you have both of these values. So I'm just gonna, would anybody like to say anything or ask anything about that? Yes, Sharon.
I just want to extend your medical.
I can't hear you. It doesn't look like you're muted, but I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm not muted. You can't hear me?
Oh, you can?
Yeah, can hear her.
Hear her. Donna's giving her a thumbs up, and I don't know why I can't hear you.
Now she's frozen. There we go. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
All right. Other people can hear you, and I can't, and I don't know why. So you talk, and somebody else will tell me what you said.
Okay. So I just wanted to extend her medical analysis to the umbilical cord, because now they've discovered that the cord blood from the umbilical cord has a lot of value to it, and people are preserving it now. And so if you take her medical analysis further, it makes a lot of sense that we have to cut the umbilical cord. So medical developments have figured out that it's worth saving and we could do great things with it. So I mean, it goes right back to her medical analysis.
Can you hear me, Debbie?
No, I can't. I'm going to go in and out again and see if that solves it, because I can't hear you either, Donna, and I don't know why. The only thing I don't think, if I end this, I'm only worried that if I end it, you're all going to get knocked off.
No,
No? All right,
no.
I'm going to try to go in and out again and see if that solves the issue.
Can you hear
All right,
me?
let's try that again.
So can you hear me or no? You can't hear me?
Sharon.
No.
She can't hear
All right,
me.
I'm sorry. I'll have to ask Nancy and Brian. This is the first time this has happened. So that makes it really hard. I'm sorry.
Rabbi?
Yes, well, you can hear me, which means my volume is turned up.
No.
Hold on, let me try one other thing.
No.
Try plugging in some earphones.
Volume.
All right, hold on. You know what? I think that worked. I think one was turned up. Yeah, the volume on my computer is up. Sharon, will you try that again? Let me see if I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. I'm sorry. I think
Okay.
the volume was on my computer and I think my speaker was off. So I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I was just embracing your medical theory because with the umbilical cord, because we've discovered in the last couple of decades that the blood from the umbilical cord has great value and people are preserving it now.
Right.
So like your whole theory with discoveries in medicine and you know, the baby comes out with the umbilical cord attached and we cut it because now we can save what's precious in it is, I mean, it just goes along with your analogy on the foreskin. I love that.
Before COVID, I really had a very different view of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community and their ability to embrace science and biomedical ethics. And there's a lot of writing, like the ultra-Orthodox community is not, you know, evangelicals and certain elements of the Christian world, when new technology is invented, especially around, cloning, like, the first reaction to cloning is this is going to be terrible and we'll clone, we'll have an army of, people will clone an army of human beings that will become slaves. Like Judaism has always embraced medical discovery and has never said any of these things were forbidden. It has to be used correctly, right? You have to be careful if you can, clone a human being. You have to decide, are they Jewish from birth? How do you need to convert them? Like there are questions that these are the questions you have to know, right? There are questions that you have to ask. There are ethics that need to be applied, but none of this is considered forbidden. And so I've always said that, it's interesting to look at a lot of ultra-Orthodox biomedical ethicists have a lot of contact with people in other communities because they're writing about the same thing and they're thinking about the same thing. And usually the default is that it's all permitted, but how do we make sure that it's regulated ethically? And so it really has shocked me to see large percentages of the ultra-Orthodox community being so vaccine hesitant or even being anti-vaxxers. There's something that just doesn't align with, for me, for everything that I've ever understood about the community and the embracing of science, and to see sort of this fundamentalist, knee-jerk, uneducated reaction, and we saw it more in Israel because there are large swaths of the Orthodox community that refused to get vaccinated and refused to wear masks and refused to stop having large gatherings, and then got sick in large numbers and took up a lot of space in hospitals. And secular Israelis who were following all the rules were very angry about, if God forbid my loved one needs a ventilator, my loved one who followed all the rules and still needs a ventilator, and that ventilator is being used by someone who refuses to follow the rules. And so, there's a lot of ethics involved in that too. And so it really very much surprised me because up until, the interesting thing I would say is, as much as ultra-Orthodox Jews think that they are so insular and separate from trends that go on around them in the world, and yet not, and maybe don't even see themselves how they're not as insular as they would think, and there are trends that are happening in other communities that is happening in those communities as well. But in any case, up until now, it's always been my belief is that we've, as Jews, and not just secular Jews who love science and, but very traditional Jews who've embraced these unbelievable discoveries and the idea, like, the umbilical cord and the blood. And again, if God has a sense of humor, waiting, like, I've been waiting for you to discover this. And I'm so excited for you that now you can, use this to benefit people. It's a pretty incredible thing. Like it's sort of not that different from thinking about, you know, God's creations, and how magnificent they are. But again, without human intelligence, it's and tech, you know, and the things that we are able to do, it's pretty incredible. All right,
So
let's.
it's like, is it like God has given us the raw materials and we're able to use science
Exactly.
and knowledge to create from it? So
Correct.
it kind of doesn't go back to, I mean, I didn't really think about it before, but it is kind of unusual that the Orthodox community was refusing mask wearing and vaccine, but was willing to rely on medicine to save their lives once they were sick. It's like a cognitive dissonance,
Right.
isn't it? It just
I mean,
doesn't
they're not
seem to
Jehovah's
fit.
Witnesses, right? I mean, the
Or
Orthodox
Christian
or Christian
Scientologists.
Science, right? The Orthodox community,
So that's so interesting to me.
but I feel like
I
this,
never thought of it that way before, that like they were refusing science on the front end,
Right.
but they were okay with science
Right.
on the back end,
Well-
but weren't both ultimately traceable back to God,
right.
creating the vaccine and creating ventilators. I mean, I don't know.
Right. Well, but we said that about like American anti-vaxxers, right? They wouldn't get a vaccine, but they didn't stop taking their diabetes medication, right? They wouldn't get a vaccine, but they take ivermectin. They wouldn't take a vaccine, but they, of course, also use the ventilators and the technology. And it's like they go to doctors. Like I mean, you know, I mean, maybe who knows what their doctors, maybe their doctors were, you know, vaccine skeptics. I don't know, but we've all been sort of stunned at like, but you don't refuse all medicine. Like it's just because this is new, maybe, or because you heard somebody on a news channel that you watch that told you shouldn't do it and you trust that person more than your physician. Like it's, I think we've all been so, you know, I will say with all of the meetings that I've had with congregants, which by the way, if you haven't met with me, the offer still stands. I would say 90% of the meetings, whatever else people were talking about, ended up talking about what is wrong with people and why won't they get vaccinated? Like this has been the great mystery of the last year. And it was, and I say it felt personally disheartening to see it in where I saw it in the Jewish community, not at Am Yisrael. I said mostly for the Jews that I know, the issue was not in the beginning, was not whether to get vaccinated. The issue was, should I skip the line? How fast should I run to get vaccinated? And is it a moral problem if I go before my turn? Or it's not a moral problem. I'm going before my turn. I'm going at the first opportunity. That was the community that I experienced, right? And of course, as it turned out, there was plenty for everybody because we didn't understand that there would be many people that wouldn't take it. So it's disheartening to see it in the Jewish community, both in, you know, I only know in the United States and then even more in Israel. But, you know, in Israel, you really saw the really real worry that these large communities of ultra-Orthodox were putting the rest of the community in real danger because they continue to host super spreader events, weddings and funerals, and you'd see these pictures of thousands of people crammed together. And so it was very frightening. Like most of us live separate from the super spreader events, you know, like in the Ozarks or, you know, wherever this was happening in other places. All right, I think we have time for one more. Okay, let's do this one. This is a, to quote Rabbi Frankel, a very famous text to a small group of people. So this is actually a text from the Torah itself. So I might have started with this text and then gone chronologically, but this is a text from the Torah itself. And so the Torah talks about, I'm just going to stop for 1 second. So the Torah talks about, this is about waging war. And that when you wage a war, one of the things that happened in ancient times is people lived in walled cities. So think Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem's a walled city. Tiberias is a walled city. So the way you protected yourself is you built a wall around your city and then the enemy couldn't get in, which worked okay unless the enemy was big enough that they could lay a siege around the city and cut you off from food and from water. And so what they would do while they were laying siege to the city is they would build, I guess what was called siege works, which were ramps and ladders and the like that would allow them to then invade, get into the city. So what did you use to build these siege works? You used whatever was around, including trees. So this is what Deuteronomy says. When in your war against a city, you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it. So this is if the Jewish army, right? The Israelite army, which would also be going to war against a city. And so you're putting the city under siege and you're building siege work and you're building. You must not destroy its trees, wielding the axe against them. You may eat of them, but you must not cut them down. Are trees of the field human to withdraw before you into the besieged city? But then it modifies it. Only trees that you know do not yield food may be destroyed. You may cut them down for constructing siege works against the city that is waging war with you until it's been reduced. So you can cut down trees to build these ramps and ladders and the things that you need, but not food trees. You may not cut down food-bearing trees. Eileen?
So we had, the area I live in is very observant. We had a neighbor who had a mulberry tree that seeded itself. They fly in and they take root. And it was right next to his garage. And Ben was out there talking to him and he said, you need to get that tree out of there because the roots are going to break up the bottom of your garage. And he said, well, I have to ask my rabbi. So he went to the rabbi and the rabbi told him, well, if it has fruit, you have to leave it because the birds will eat from it. So he left the tree. 5-6 years later, we noticed the tree is down. Why? Because it was breaking up the floor of his garage and he had decided it was enough.
I mean, that's that. So there's listen, that's an amazing example. There's actually a much, the Israeli army, it's not incumbent upon the Israeli army to follow the laws of the Torah, right? It's a modern army and, the Torah laws are suggestions, but they're not the be all and end all of an army decision. But there was an issue during both the first and second Intifada that Palestinians were hiding in their olive groves and launching things at the Israeli army. And so they started cutting down the olive groves to get to these people that were dangerous. And there was some moral outcry in Israel about, the Torah could not be more specific that you're not allowed to cut down fruit-bearing trees. And so, they still cut down trees. Like the army hasn't stopped, doing it. I bet they haven't been doing it as much as they used to do it. But this is where the real world, or the mulberry tree, right? The real world hits the ideal world, which is, do you sacrifice your garage for this fruit-bearing tree? So these are real issues. Ron.
Mute.
Can I be heard now?
Yes.
What you're talking about reminded me of what was his name? Ron from he was at the senior center a lot, died very young. He was a speaker and he was a former priest. Do you remember who he was, what his last name was?
Sorry.
He was a former priest and he spoke at the senior center a lot. He spoke mostly about accepting other faiths, especially Islam. Well, I remember one day at one of his lectures about Islam, one of our Jewish friends said, how can I possibly be comfortable with the Quran, which is so dreadfully, what's the word? I'm not doing very well this evening. It was full of war and violence. So Ron said, well, if you feel that way, you must look at Deuteronomy 20, which of course is where the Israelites are lined up to cross into the land of Canaan and are directed by God to kill every living thing except the trees that bear fruit. So that this is nothing new, what you're reading now. And it's interesting how this carries forward on and consistent.
Right. Yeah, look, the
That's all.
Torah is full of war and violence and things that we would find, reprehensible, right? I mean, the Israelites are commanded to wipe out the 7 Canaanite nations and conquer the land. Many years ago, I had the privilege of hearing Professor Moshe Habertal, who is a Jewish philosopher and ethicist who was at the Hartman Institute. I got to hear him there. He was a professor at Hebrew University. I think he's now at Harvard. But he helped rewrite the code of ethics for the Israeli army. And it was an amazing talk because he talked about, you can't have parents of Israeli soldiers who are currently in the army write the code of ethics. I mean, he was using the example. Nobody was suggesting that you should do that. Because if it was your son or daughter that was captured, you'd raise all of Gaza to get them back. There would be nothing that you wouldn't want the army to do to get them back. And that's why you have to have people that can step back and can assess how many soldiers could you really risk, and how do you weigh out when you go in and when you don't go in, and how do you figure that out? Not that you don't love this, in theory, love this soldier and want to save them and protect them, but when do you make the decision of how to risk your soldiers, and when do those soldiers make decisions about how they treat a civilian population that are aligned with your enemies? Because if it's your kid, who cares, right? But you can't conduct an ethical army under the laws of the Torah and say, go and wipe them all out. I've actually heard, unfortunately, Jewish people say, like during Gaza, we should just nuke Gaza. It's like, we should just nuke Gaza. That's like, we're Putin now, right? We should be the kind of people that would support nuking a civilian population that's living under a fascist terrorist government. Not to mention, you live right next door. Like, the nukes don't stop at the border, the fallout, but forget that for a minute. So war, the ethics of war have evolved. Yes, of course, the Torah has that. The Torah has lots of things that we would, that kills people for violating Shabbat, but Judaism is an organic religion that has changed over thousands of years. And the rabbis, we were not the first generation to change these things. The rabbis began already 2,000 years ago to change certain things that they thought were unethical in the Torah, like the treatment of slaves, or even the treatment of women, or, they didn't go as far as we would have liked them to go, but things began to, Judaism was not frozen in time for all and forever. So yes, we have to acknowledge that we have these very horrific texts, but at the same time, those texts don't guide us today when we make decisions, when people make decisions about how you would execute, a war against your enemies. Anyways, I'm going to stop there. That's just a smattering. I want to say one other thing.
Oh, his name was Ron Miller.
Was he like from Common Ground?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I know who. Yeah.
He was extremely brilliant.
Yeah. I haven't thought about him in a long time. He gave a lot of,
languages.
he was an exceptional educator and did a lot of interfaith work. Judaism has a value that's called Baal Tashchit that grows out of this thing about not cutting down trees. And it basically means it's don't waste. And so, when your, parents used to say to you, like, don't waste your food, their children starving in Africa, it's actually considered a violation of Jewish law to waste food, clothes, anything, to waste anything. So things need to be reused, things need to be recycled. You need to think carefully. And one of the ways, interestingly enough, that this plays itself out is it's one of the reasons that Jews are supposed to be buried in burial shrouds and not clothing, because you can donate the clothing to people in need. So it would be wasteful to bury clothing under the ground. It's really there's nothing really more mystical than that. I share this all the time when I talk about the concept of not wasting. You can't cut down fruit trees, you can't, but my kids many, many years ago, because our oldest is a dad now, went to Moriah daycare. And one of the things that I used to see, people don't do this anymore, but it was really in style for a while, is I would see the floral arrangement on Sunday morning or Monday, not Sunday morning, Monday morning that was left over from the bar bat mitzvah. I don't know if you ever saw this, Donna, when you were walking into Moriah. So there would be this gorgeous floral arrangement that they would have in the foyer of the synagogue. And in the vase of water, they would have fruit that matched the flowers, right? So if you had red flowers, you'd have apples. And if you had orange flowers, you'd have oranges. So you would have apples or oranges or whatever this edible fruit was, basically sitting in water for days and days and days. And then when the floral arrangement got, old and tired, you'd throw the whole thing out. And it used to make me insane, because it was a violation of this Jewish law of not wasting. I did talk to the executive director. I had no pull there. My kids were in daycare. I had no pull. I talked to her. She's like, well, what can we really do about it? This is what people order. We don't micromanage what they order. But I never let people do that at Am Yisrael, ever. And then the trend passed, thank God, which I think is a good thing. But I'm like, Chris Rock, if you remember the comedian Chris Rock, talked about going to Africa. And he said in Africa, they don't say, I don't eat red meat. They say, I don't eat green meat. Like, you have to be a particularly affluent society to use food as a decoration, which then gets thrown in the garbage. And so all of these things, when we talk about the environment, are all part of sort of the Jewish ethics of how we're supposed to care for our world, how we're supposed to think about the resources that we've been given, how we think about how we take what we've been given and improve upon it. And of course, the reminder that we started with is that, no, God's not going to come in and save us. And if we destroy the only world we have, we're going to have to live with those consequences.
So do you think that the don't kill the trees, the fruit-bearing trees, is more to do with preserving them for future generations? Like, it's okay to kill the people now because they're your enemy,
Right.
and you can kill them however you want, but you need to preserve the trees because we need to save them for future generations.
Right. And when
is
you
that what it
are
is?
even in a siege, like there may be, hopefully women and children that survive, like people, you're not
Right.
necessarily killing, yes, the 7 Canaanite
Right.
nations, which by the way, we never killed them. They stuck around. So we never actually did it. But there are people in that you're not killing everybody in the society, right? So
Right.
people are gonna have to eat. And so for you to destroy their trees, not even just future generations, but the survivors of this war, let's say they all surrender. And then you're not at war with them anymore, and you haven't left them with food, and they're going to starve to death. Like, you can't do that. Sima? Wait, you need to unmute yourself, please.
Muted.
Wait, hold on. Let me see if I can. Sima, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. It must be generational, because when I was a child and they talked about wasting food, I never heard anybody in my generation say, while they're starving in Africa. They all said they were starving in Europe. And so Africa was never even mentioned when I was a child growing up in basically most contexts. And but the same principle was there, but it was always children that were starving in Europe.
That is fascinating, because I am younger than you, and I would think that any Jewish parent that talked about people starving in Europe, because they knew. they'd come from there, their parents had come from there,
Right.
they knew what real starvation was. I just shared this recently again, that my great grandmother who came over, who I'm named for, her husband came over from Poland, and then he brought her and her sons over, and she hid bread for the rest of her life. So yeah, in her house. But yeah, my grandparents were all born in the United States, and I was a child of the 60s and early 70s. And
Right.
so,
But I'm just
for
saying,
that- yeah,
the
that's
same
fascinating.
concept was there, but, but that was the context in
Yeah,
which it was said.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Anybody else have anything? So I hope you've enjoyed these 4 weeks. There's more in the ethics curriculum. So I'm gonna send out a little survey, and you can be anonymous, but if you'd like to see like 4 weeks in May of another 4 weeks of Jewish ethics, same time, same Tuesday night, 7:30. You can, and if you don't want to, it's fine. Like, you didn't sign up for life. But we'll get a sense if people want to continue. There's more curriculum, and I'm happy to continue with it.
On Zoom?
On Zoom. Yeah, I think on Zoom. I
It's
feel
easier.
like, yeah, I think this year on Zoom, next year in Jerusalem, this year on Zoom. Yeah, I think so. I feel like I like to be an optimist, but we do know what's happening in the UK. I did see cases are on the rise again in
China.
Israel. And I feel like, I hope to God that May will be a month that we can all be together in person, but who can really plan?
Are you going to continue the morning class also?
Yeah, also in May, but different. We're done with the ethics curriculum. So Tuesday morning, we'll look at one of the other, there's faith, peoplehood, and I think practice. But there's still more of the ethics curriculum for people that want to finish up with that. So we'll just send a little survey and see what people want to do.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Deb.
you.
Good night,
It's a pleasure.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.